Now, we're here today to talk about all of these subjects with a really amazing panel, 3 online, and Koos here, and I'm very, very grateful to them for joining us. Koos Dietrich, who is MD of the Landscape Resilience Fund at South Pole. Avril Beshimol, who's Senior Sustainable Finance Specialist at Jeff. And Jay Ko, who's the co-founder and MD of the Lightsmith Group, as well as Tran Trung Hien, Vice Director of Ludong Company. So we're going to be hearing from all of them in turn. I'll ask a few questions, but I'd really like the discussion here and online to liven up and so that we can hear from as many of you as possible. So do start to gather up your questions and think about what you'd like to say. So let's start with you, Koos, if I may ask, to tell us a little bit about the work that you do and why we're here today.
Yes, thank you very much. Very happy to be here, and it's been a very exciting COP, and as you already said, resilience and adaptation really will go down as a major topic here at the COP. At the same time, it's also the topic of lots of controversial debates here, and I think that's a good thing. Let's still wait for 1.5 days, and we'll see what will be the real result. And I think the importance of this topic, climate adaptation and climate resilience, is something that WWF and South Pole realized when they sat together a couple of years ago and thought about how can we integrate different elements that are needed to drive the world forward, including adaptation and resilience, including biodiversity conservation and climate mitigation, alongside other SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, for example, particularly also gender mainstreaming and diversity. And with this in mind, we founded the Landscape Resilience Fund this year, and we are very happy about this progress and look forward to the implementation over the next years.
Fantastic. I think I should have had a slide up there if I'm not wrong, so maybe we should we put that slide up now? Oh, is it up there already? Many apologies. I'll move on then. These are our speakers. I should have introduced myself. I'm Exec Director of Advocacy and Campaigns at WWF UK, and then we've got some of the names of our other speakers here as well. And I'll just put your slide up now as well. If there's anything you'd like to add, seeing the slide, then let me know, or please just speak. Tell us a little bit, just tell us one more thing about the LRF, what you're really proud of in terms of what you've either achieved so far or will be achieving in the coming years.
Thank you, yes, and I would certainly say it revolves around the element of integration, because climate change is here today. It's a complex issue. There's no simple solution that will get us where we need to go. And we also know that solutions need to be locally led, they need to be scaled, and they need to be integrated with the different problems and solutions that surround them. And I think the Landscape Resilience Fund, LRF for short, is a good example of effective collaboration between different organizations, with WWF and South Pole bringing together an organization from the nonprofit sector and a private company across different countries. And what you can see here on the slide is that we have 3 different funding windows that pay tribute to the fact that this is a complex problem. We're based in a landscape approach. We really look at the interests of local stakeholders, potentially conflicting interests, and also any resource constraints that they may be, to then selectively promote and scale these solutions that we feel are most aligned with the local priorities. And in order to do that, we don't just give finance and investment, and it's an important part, but we also notice that a lot of the projects and small businesses need further assistance in order to receive and make good use of this finance. So this is why we have the middle funding window that we call investment readiness. And then luckily we're supported by the Global Environment Facility as a winner of the Challenge Program for Adaptation and Innovation to receive money to help prepare projects to receive and make good use of investment. And we use this money, for example, for better bookkeeping and documentation, for better environmental and social risk management, for negotiating offtake agreements, and for better business planning and financial modeling, for example. And that's really the main pillar of what we do. We help scale these small businesses that we consider well adapted to climate change with climate resilient practices, or those that we consider to have a high potential to become very well adapted and ensure and increase the resilience of all the surrounding communities. We scale them through flexible loans to then also connect them to additional co-investment from the return-seeking private investor side. And this is something I think that shows how integrated we are to try to bring together different stakeholders, different solutions, to make sure this complex problem is adequately addressed.
Thank you so much, Cause. And so now we're going to hear a little bit from Avril. Thank you, Avril, for joining us. Avril is, as I said, the Senior Sustainable Finance Specialist at Jeff, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, if you can, about investment readiness, but also the LRF more broadly.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to join you today here in this panel. And before I jump into the question you just asked, I just wanted to say that from the Jeff, experience in investment in adaptation is part of our business as usual. Since 2001, we have invested nearly $2 billion in grant financing, mobilizing $13 billion in nearly 400 projects. More specifically, the way we are engaging with the private sector is through this challenge program for adaptation innovation that, as Urs just mentioned here today, we open for concepts broadly all around the world and receive very interesting innovative and projects and ideas for us to invest and support. This challenge program is part of the broader, I would say, strategy of the Jeff to involve and engage the private sector in responding to adaptation challenges. The science is clear, and what we are hearing, and what the numbers you just gave of 5% only climate finance going to adaptation makes that we know that public funding is not enough, and we need to involve the private sector. Ingenuity, innovation, and the ideas we receive from the ground makes that, for example, in the last challenge program, I believe we received more than 700 proposals, of which we just awarded a couple of days ago 10 projects. The Resilience Fund, the Landscape Resilience Fund, was our first winner a couple of years ago in the previous COP, and it was announced there together with other winners, other 9 proposals that also were announced 2 years ago. And it basically shows how an integrated approach needs to be designed to respond to the very complex challenges that are faced on the ground. And in this integrated approach, we're having the involvement at all times of the private sector, together with financiers at local level. So this is how at the Jeff, through the Least Developed Countries Fund and the Special Climate Change Fund, so 2 specific funds, we have designed this very broad call for proposals to hear basically what are the needs and to support those needs with our grant financing to prepare these very innovative models like what we just heard.
And how do you, if I just may ask a follow-up question, Avril, how do you ensure that you have a very broad range of applications to the Challenge Fund, that they come from all sorts of places, not just your usual suspects? How do you reach out to places that really need the money and yet may not be investment ready, nor have the experience of applying to a fund like the one you're describing?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so we at the Jeff have been around for 30 years and have friends and support from many actors in different arenas, including the governments. We work with our counterparts, what we call the operational focal points in the countries where we operate. We also have the involvement of many NGOs at local level, and we also work with a myriad of partners, including our agencies that include multilateral development banks, but also other, I would say, agencies and friends like WWF, who would help us in the broad outreach of these proposal or this open call for concepts. What's very important here, I think, is this direct engagement. So this very broad call saying to any proponent that has an idea that can provide a solution for adaptation to directly engage with us. And I think that removing these barriers of the middleman and just receiving these concepts in a very, I would say, open manner has give us the clear impression that there is appetite, there is the need, and there are many very interesting ideas and projects that can be financed from climate funds like us or other donors and also philanthropies for sure.
Thank you, Avril. Fantastic, and great to hear that in some ways you can cut out the middleman. Although I imagine it must be overwhelming to have quite so many applications and interest. Jay Cole, thank you so much for joining us. Jay is co-founder and MD of the Lightsmith Group. Hello. If you could introduce yourself, tell us a little bit more about the Lightsmith Group and your involvement in this or otherwise, and on adaptation, I would love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, and really great to be here. It's sort of a little bit of an out-of-body experience for me because Urs and I were in the same place about 3 days ago. Very excited to be with South Pole and some of the other wonderful winners of the Jeff's latest challenge program. I mean, obviously, Urs had been one of the previous winners, and I think the Jeff is really, as I said that day, assembling really a constellation of stars that start to create a pattern for the ecosystem that is going to be the adaptation landscape going forward. I'm really excited about that. Lightsmith is a sustainable private equity firm that is focused for the first time on climate resilience and adaptation. We have an investment strategy known as the Climate Resilience and Adaptation Finance and Technology Transfer Facility, or CRAFT, that has been supported by the Jeff since 2017. We're a really proud partner of the Jeff in piloting that strategy and then scaling it up. And most recently at the COP last week announced the up to $100 million approval by the GCF board of potential additional commitments to that strategy as we kind of move forward, both public and private investors. The two things I would say to add to what Urs and Avril are talking about are, in addition to, I think, adaptation and resilience becoming finally at the forefront, or closer to the forefront, let's see, at this COP, in part given the unfortunate human tragedies we've continue to see unfold this year. I mean, you could have picked the continent to get flooded out of in May, June, July of this year, whether it was North America, Asia, Europe, different parts of South America, and then sub-Saharan Africa. There were fires in multiple geographies occurring all at the same time, and a lot of tragic loss of human life. Attribution, I think, is becoming much more clear that this is a phenomenon that unfortunately is going to continue to unfold at an accelerating rate. That being said, to the point that you're talking about, I think one of the examples, in addition to the craft strategy that Jeff's been very successful in supporting, we're also very proud of our relationship with Conservation International as one of those partners, our implementing agency in this context. But it's also a strategy called ASAP, the Adaptation SME Accelerator Project, which sought to do three things. First, to create a taxonomy or a definition for the first time of what is an adaptation SME, which I think is the topic of this conversation, one that is consistent with IPCC orientation as well as the European Union Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, so we can identify which kinds of companies actually have technologies and solutions to help assess increasing risk and impact exacerbated by climate change and help to manage that impact. Second, to create a global network of those entities as well as other stakeholders, and that's been launched last year at climateasap.org. That's at least populated, I think, over 200 and really closer to 400 or 600 companies that fit the adaptation solutions taxonomy. That's also on that website. And then third, we're very proud to have launched at the COP last week the accelerator piece of that program together with Village Capital, which has been very successful at helping SMEs and startups kind of scale up. And in this case, the partnership is to take an existing SME and to provide them with the tools and the definitions and the access to the network of relationships to help scale up those adaptation SMEs. I think in the context of the different types of instruments like the Landscape Resilience Fund and other strategies, what you're beginning to see now is the emergence of a frontier of different approaches to adaptation and climate resilience, whether it's at the landscape level or project level or at the company level, whether they're SMEs or growth stage companies, and not just in one country, but across multiple developing countries and in developed countries that can transfer their technologies to those developing countries. So in that context, I think that Jeff has been, as Avril said, a very long-standing actor with tremendous expertise in adaptation. I think the ability to integrate the expertise in biodiversity into that discussion is really critical, and to work with WWF and other partners in that context could be extremely helpful. But what is wonderful is to begin to see some serious focus and hopefully additional capital flow towards these types of tools and technologies. Companies help them scale up and begin to address what will unfortunately be an increasingly challenging environment going forward, particularly in developing countries, even if we keep global warming to the 1.5 degree mark. So we're excited to be partnered with the public and private sector in this, and we applaud this convening here just to kind of focus on practical solutions to help scale up those technologies for developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jay. And if I can just ask a slightly stupid question, it might sound like, what is an adaptation SME? When you talked about defining what it is, tell me how that definition works. And then a second question is, could you give me an example of a really successful SME that you would define to be an adaptation one?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's by no means a silly question. If you look back at the Adaptation Gap Report 2014 and any of the consistent literature that comes forward, a lot of the challenges in engaging, particularly the private sector, has been uncertainty and a lack of a clear approach or definition to what's entailed in adaptation. It's as if we were 15 years ago in the mitigation space. Like, no one walks out in the morning and says, I'd like a loaf of bread and a basket of mitigation or adaptation. What you want is energy that is low carbon. You want transportation that is low carbon. You want food that is low carbon. And the same way, you want energy systems, transportation systems, and food systems that are going to be resilient and adapted to the unfortunately changing future that we're all going to face here. And so 90+% of the companies you've ever talked to have never called themselves climate change anything, or literally never heard the word adaptation or resilience in this context. It's a component or a feature of what they do rather than sort of what they would define as what they do. And most companies don't call themselves mitigation companies either. That's something that falls into the landscape of the OECD and UNFCCC. What we've done then is to try to create a practical approach to identifying those companies that are adaptation solutions companies. That was in a peer-reviewed process. The Adaptation Solutions Taxonomy, which is available at that website, climateasap.org, takes a kind of a process approach rather than a whitelist, blacklist approach. In part because if we look at the history of mitigation, if we had defined all of mitigation as simply solar panels, we would never look forward to a transition to electric vehicles or low carbon agriculture or low carbon buildings or all of the other components of the low carbon transition, which are well beyond just the energy sector. So our approach in the Adaptation Solutions Taxonomy is a process approach. First, begin by identifying IPCC or German Watch identified climate vulnerability that is specific to a geography and a time scale, like drought in Eastern Africa or wildfire in California, or increased tropical cyclone impact in the southwestern part of India. And then find companies that have potential technologies or solutions that can do one of two things. First, at a systemic level, begin to help assess and measure that set of impacts. So give us a shape of how that risk is going to change going forward. And second, to actually have physical products and services to help to manage or address those risks and impacts. So if you can connect the dots between a specific vulnerability and a technology or solution that can assess that to help us understand the shape and the pathway of it, or to help us to actually manage that impact, then you can actually start to describe that company as an adaptation solutions company. And that falls also very consistently within the definition of economic activities that support these kinds of activities underneath the adaptation activities underneath the European Union's Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, which is one of the first legal definitions of this kind of activities to be supported by European governments and investors. Examples are really important here. So let me give you just two. One is a company that we invested in last year called Source, beyond the SME phase, but is in the growth stage. And what they have developed is a water harvesting technology solution. It's called a solar hydro panel. This is in the form factor of what looks like a solar electricity panel, but it uses solar thermal energy primarily in a proprietary material and system. And so instead of generating from the sun and air electricity, it generates between 5 and 9 liters of pure drinking water per day, per panel, in almost any set of atmospheric conditions around the world. So this is a solution that is, in our view, what the Jeff has historically called a transformative or systemic solution. It's not simply taking desalination and reducing its carbon footprint by 5 or 10% per year. It's moving to an entirely different methodology for taking water vapor out of the atmosphere and then converting into pure drinking water that can be deployed on a 100% renewable basis, on a distributed basis, just like we deployed solar electricity. So you could deploy it alongside solar electric panels on the roofs of homes in remote villages, in large scale fields, and move towards a pay-as-you-go water, just as you've gone to a pay-as-you-go electricity business model. And that dramatically allows you to accelerate the reduction in cost of this kind of technology. So that's a physical solution. It addresses water scarcity, which you can identify in specific, multiple specific geographies around the world. SIDS and LICs have a dramatic amount of this increasing stress, as can be identified in their NDA and their NAPs, and a lot of the work that's being done by the GEF, WWF, and others. And so I think that there's an example of physical product and services. There's also technology around agricultural analytics that we are also investing in out of the craft strategy and earlier stage companies like that really identify where there is going to be increasing impact from drought or weather volatility on the production of agriculture, which is a substantial challenge, as well as issues with the inefficiencies in the supply chain for food to get to actual consumers and increasing food wastage, both of which will be exacerbated in specific geographies under specific timescales by the effects of climate change. So technology to understand how the path of agricultural risk is going to change is technology we think that creates the potential for adaptation, builds capacity in the private sector, the tools in the private sector to assess it. Physical products like hydro panels can address water scarcity issues as those issues are being exacerbated by climate change as well. So those are two examples for you.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Jay. And now, sorry to make you wait, Tran Trung Kien, who's Vice Director of the Ludong Company, who I believe is going to give us an example, if I can find the clicker, of your work in Vietnam. So if please, if you could explain to us a little bit about your business and what you've been doing from an adaptation perspective, I would be very grateful.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you today. My name is Trần Trung Hiếu. I'm Vice Director of Ludong Company. Our company located in Central Annamai landscape in Vietnam. So our company had to become a reputable and one of the largest companies in sustainable rattan plantation and processing in Vietnam. We will make the high quality rattan fiber, and then we supply it for domestic and international market. So nowadays we have 3 operating business now. First, we contracted with the local farmer, local community. We will help them to plant rattan, to protect the rattan tree in the mountain, and then we will contract it to buy rattan tree from them. So it helps the people in the mountain had a livelihood and had a job for them. The second business operation is our factory. You can see in the slide. This is our factory. So we do rattan processing. We make a rattan core, rattan bill, and then we supply to the local handicraft company. Then they make the product for export. And finally, we had a solar power system in the rooftop of our company, as you see in the picture. So now our factory use solar power electric for our processing. And we sell surplus to national electricity grid. So really, I'm the second generation. My father and my mother-in-law had a 30 years stay in the mountain to start a very small business with local ethnic people. So we had over 15 years experience in harvesting, planting, and processing rattan. And also we implemented a project that's named Sustainable Rattan Value Chain in the landscape under USAID grant. So this project have more than 500 households to have more livelihood for them. So as you see in the slide, we made the sustainable rattan value chain include smallholder, look down company is in my company, and then handicraft company, and then international market. We support smallholder with rattan seedling, cultivation training to take care of rattan forest, and then we buy rattan tree from them. So we help them sustainable livelihood. Instead, we had a sustainable income in raw material. So this is a win-win relationship. And then this sustainable have also create social and environmental benefit also, so that we create a new job for ethnic people. We made sustainable livelihood for the smallholder and preservation traditional handicraft. Because when natural rattan forest reduce, so we not enough material for our processing. So with the contrasted with the smallholder to planting rattan, to tending and protecting rattan forest, and then resupply the incoming raw material for it also. So when smallholder, the ethnic people in the mountainous area in Vietnam, they had a good income, they had a good livelihood. So it have to reducing the risk of people illegally invading the core zone of the natural forest. And at the moment, we are preparing a process to expand our business 3 times. So we submit the process already to Landscape Resident Fund with WWF Vietnam support. So we hope we had a good result, and then we can expand our business. Also, we can make sustainable rattan value chain more popular, more richer in central Annamai landscape in Vietnam. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tran Trung Hien, and sorry to make you wait for so long to tell us about that example. I'm very excited about it because it sounds like it's a very different approach to adaptation to the examples that Jay Ko were giving, in that it was an already existing second generation business that was invested in part to ensure sustainable income for people that would be most affected and might inadvertently impact on the natural environment in that area. Would that be a good way of describing it? And then, and also, could you tell me or give me some examples of how the process of getting investment through this fund has been for you, and what difference it has made to you to be part of it?
Please. I'm not here clearly. Hello?
Hello? Okay.
Yeah,
can you hear me now, Tran Trung Hien?
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. I hear you now. Okay, it's smooth again. I don't hear you again.
No, it's about the switch between. Okay. Apologies for the sound issues here. Just wondered, Tran Trung Hien, if you could tell us a little bit about the process of getting financing for this amazing second generation company that you own and are developing. What was that process like, and has the additional support in terms of investment readiness made a difference to your ability to scale?
As very small, we are very small company in Vietnam. So really, we have many main barriers to access the fund. For example, we are limited access the local bank because due to not suitable loan conditions, such as short-term loan, high interest rate, or requirement of collateral. We are limited to access international financial institutions, such as investment plan of SME must align with environmental and social safeguards. Thus, many local SME like me is still lacking. We just made a very small process before, so really we need more understanding and trusted. And the third is the lack of technical assistance, which located in the very near the mountain area and with many lack of information about technical support. So technical support is very good for us to prepare a good business plan, such as financing, risk management, such as business management training, environment, social safeguard training, something like that. And finally, I think the main barrier is lack of grant for long-term investment in rattan enrichment and planting in the natural forest. We are noticed that look down, we can invest a bath, but with rattan, it needs on at least 6 years to grow up and harvesting. And we are invest for local people, invest for smallholder in their mountain, in their land. So we not keep the key. So lack of grant for long-term investment in rattan enrichment and plant in natural. So it is very important. We need grant and we will add more funds together. It will help create sustainable livelihood for local community as well as sustainable raw material for a company. It is a win-win model, as I said before.
Thank you very much. That's extremely helpful and something I've heard a lot. Kors, I think you're going to just add to that.
Yeah, I also wanted to mention that, in fact, here the company Lukdong is a great example of addressing some real issues that we are seeing in Vietnam. Vietnam is one of the most exposed countries to tropical storms, and we know what it does to our forests if the forests aren't managed sustainably and are instead maybe monoculture plantations that don't experience good thinning and other management, or they're not actually stable natural forest ecosystems. And by ensuring that the forests around are either managed well or actually restored and replenished and altogether maintain the ecosystem functioning, this region is way better positioned to actually withstand some of these tropical storms. And this screening for the different climate impacts, just like Jay Ko described for his fund, is something we do for the Landscape Resilience Fund as well through a top-down approach by looking at various indicators in different databases, and then also through a bottom-up approach where, again, the strong local ownership and also definition of what their struggles with the current climatic changes are plays a very, very large role. And we bring these two levels together, the top-down and the bottom-up, to understand which are the types of interventions we'd like to promote and scale. And we are very much looking forward to continuing our assessment of Luc Dong in Vietnam and see if we're actually finding the right tools to help them with their business and improve the climate resilience of communities and landscapes in Vietnam.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And just while we're on the subject of barriers, I wondered if we could hear also from Avril about any barriers or indeed, Kors, if you'd like to add to that, about other barriers to investing in adaptation SMEs.
Okay, very, very quick. Certainly the knowledge about adaptation. So SMEs often don't necessarily know what are the best practices to address a certain climate threat, because climate threats sometimes also are insidious and they're slowly developing in a region, and that knowledge may just not be there as much as of now. So we hope to bring knowledge to them to help with that, while at the same time, of course, being a solution that's locally based. But basically knowledge on the SME side and knowledge on the investor side is also a strong constraint, because if you don't know which ones are the promising solutions, how would you put your money into a solution? So we also have to work on the investor side to bring in the corporate leaders out there, the philanthropic leaders in the public sector. And this is where Avril can continue to really know that the solutions that they're investing in make sense and are really promising.
And Avril, if I can ask you to answer that, but also tell me a little bit about how you, because many of the communities themselves have a huge amount of knowledge and have already been adapting. How do you make sure that the SMEs that that you're investing in are also drawn from and using that knowledge?
Yes, thank you for the questions. On the barriers, I would rather say what is not a barrier for adaptation finance. Mostly knowledge, information, metrics, understanding that this is not only a new area. When we ask about definitions, like what Jay just mentioned, or what Tran just mentioned is doing in Vietnam. But very interestingly, and I think I would just share with you what we're seeing at the GEF in a broader way, is that adaptation and resilience overlaps a lot with climate change mitigation, land degradation, and biodiversity benefits. So we kind of, when we had discussions with Jay, when we were discussing investment in craft, is that all of these new technologies, all of these SMEs that are already doing something in adapting are probably accounting for some type of climate change mitigation benefit. So we just heard of the water, solar water devices, but also that in Vietnam, they're using also solar energy. Probably then these two investments are checking the box on climate change mitigation, but since we don't have the knowledge, the metrics, and the way of measuring this, we are totally missing what we are doing in resilience. And so I would say that, you know, we're seeing a blurred frontier and more of an integrative approach and I would say design from private sector clients who do not speak the language of the UNFCCC and us environmentalists, but rather see that the business opportunity can generate a lot of benefits in many environmental areas, including resilience. It's just a matter for us to, again, have the knowledge, the metrics, and report on that, because I think we're already doing quite a lot, but we're just not labeling it the way we should label it. And this is an interesting exercise. We are, I think, more and more coming together and understanding. We just heard two very precise examples that are using technologies that could be labeled climate change mitigation or land degradation. And as we move, I would say, forward, it would be to not only have purely adaptation projects or purely mitigation projects, but environmentally sound projects that generates its benefits kind of like intelligent or smart in that respect. And we can only say that the metrics, the knowledge is missing, that what we need is to have at local level and at local players, not only from the technical assistance side, but also local financial intermediaries, microfinance institutions, credit cooperatives, to get the knowledge and institutionalize these measures of vulnerability and risk on the one side, but also on the other side, whenever there is investment in environmentally sound projects, there's probably a resilient aspect to it. It's just we haven't captured it yet. And I would just leave it there.
So just one last question, and then I'll open it up to questions online and in the room as well. We've obviously not got very long, and whilst getting it right in terms of what's an adaptation project and what's a mitigation project, you're right in a way. The two are so interlinked together. But this level of urgency that I and others feel here, and I'm sure you do as well, means that, my question is, I suppose, how might we leverage some of the systemic transitions that need to be made to get more money to the right places at scale? So if I can give an example, in the UK, we heard just last week the UK Chancellor announce mandatory transition plans for the finance sector to make the City of London the greenest centre ever. How might you introduce some sort of aspect to those mandatory plans that might leverage more private finance for adaptation and adaptation? So Jay, you've got your hand up there. Please come in.
Yeah, I think Avril's point and your question are leading the same direction. And so I would just say kind of two things. One is we're going to live in a single world going forward, and we always do. It's not a world that's either mitigated or adapted. It needs to be both. And so that single world needs to be systemically addressed, right? So the low carbon transition needs to be a resilient net zero transition. And so GFANZ, for example, I'd rather it actually be GFANZer, which is the kind of Glasgow focus on the kind of net zero and resilient transition that we're talking about. Because if you don't focus on adaptation resilience, even the investments we're making to support mitigation will fail. There are a number of examples of hydropower shortages that we're already seeing in California, for example, this year because of drought. If we care about wind, solar, hydro being the future, we need to make sure they're designed for a future with different weather patterns and so on. There are a number of LEED platinum, highly energy efficient buildings that were flooded over the entrance to the building by hurricanes in the last several years. So unless we actually think about integrating both of these strategies together, we're going to end up being surprised on one side or the other. If you don't have adaptation strategies that are low carbon, you'll compound the problem. If you don't have net zero strategies or low carbon strategies that are resilient, you will be destroyed just like everything else. And so I think that is kind of the integrated kind of climate 2.0 or climate smart approach that Avril is talking about, and making sure that there's flexibility of the instruments to actually coordinate both of these activities. And I think you see this on the ground. The project in Vietnam has solar panels on it. It makes sure that that's a mitigation strategy. But if it has localized storage for energy, if there's extreme weather events in that part of Vietnam, which will increasingly be the case across the planet, then it has the chance for much quicker recovery from those storms. You can provide a staging point for actual recovery from the impact of those natural disasters. The data and analytics that we're supporting to analyze how rattan production might change can also be used to actually predict and reduce the impact of natural disasters on communities that are there. And if we also don't integrate an equity approach and a gender-oriented approach the way we're approaching these strategies, and again, the other complexity of biodiversity, then we're going to continue to miss parts of what is going to be the future that we're living in here going forward. So how do you do all those complicated things at the same time? I think the two things that are exciting about this COP are, one, I think the launch of a $130 trillion private sector strategy aligning towards net zero. Again, that strategy needs to be integrated with a resilience and adaptation future, and it needs to work hand in hand in equity orientation and one that accounts for gender and biodiversity. So we have a lot of different features in the systemic approach that we need to do. But two, we have some movement. You have commitments to deforestation reduction, you have commitments to methane, you have commitments potentially, and we'll see what happens in the next couple of days at the COP on those ends of the spectrum as well. But there's also multiple instruments. So one of the things that we're very proud of at this COP was that the CRAFT strategy received the support of the US government and the Nordic Development Fund for funding for a technical assistance facility to accelerate the deployment of these types of technologies on a grant basis into LICs and SIDS and vulnerable populations. So there's a need for scaling investment capital. I think the LRF has a similar strategy here to deploy technologies at commercial scale and to draw capital in and to prove the point that you can invest in net zero resilient strategies and make a return on investment. That will cause an acceleration of capital flows. But if we can accelerate in time, like by the time machine, if you will, of a technical assistance facility, bring technologies that may be a little bit too expensive today, but will be affordable tomorrow as those prices go down, as we've seen in solar electricity, to LICs and SIDS right now that have the most vulnerability right now, that have the most humanitarian impact right now, then I think we have a chance to try to make this transition a little bit less jagged sideways and a bit more smoother and premeditated. So I think it's a question of having the design criteria to be integrated. That includes not just an adaptation focus or a mitigation focus. We're going to live in a single future. It's going to have a whole bunch of different features to it. We need to integrate them as we kind of move forward. So I think that's the right approach.
And if I may add,
yeah, we like to divide
Jay,
ourselves with our language, don't we? I mean, before I came to work at WWF, I was like, what's the difference between nature and climate? Surely they're the same thing. In a way, we just need to be less good at dividing ourselves into categories, which is something we do as humans, but better at bringing all of these things together. Cause, do you want to add to that? And then I really will open up. Please, if you're online, put your questions into Zoom. I've got my mobile phone here. I'm not just texting my family at the same time as running this event. I'm looking to see if there are questions that will be WhatsApp to me. So if you're online, please do add in your questions and think about questions here. Cause, I'll let you sum up a little bit and then we'll open up.
Sure, thank you. Yes, and to your question about transitioning and systemic shifts, that's something that we're looking at with the Landscape Resilient Fund in two ways, and I see a strong role for the public sector in catalyzing more private sector investment. And we can see an example with the Jeff Challenge program, and we hope that there'll be many more that in a very flexible way will allow early prototyping, testing, and then scaling of successful initiatives. But for that, you need some money that will then catalyze more money. And I think the public sector is well positioned to provide this finance, which just needs to be a small amount and can be scaled at least 10x through the private sector later on. Second, we need to also understand the value change that we're seeing, the social norms and values that we live in. And I think we see a strong shift here among leading companies worldwide. So this COP is called the corporate COP in some way, because you can really see a lot of commitments that come from the private sector, from large companies, in understanding their responsibilities, not only for their products, but also for the entire value chain and for the people and communities that live up their value chain. For example, we have Chanel as anchor investor that provided $25 million as a grant to us to really also help them learn how to understand resilience better. And while we're not explicitly working in their supply chains, they say, look, we'll still be able to transfer some lessons that we get through our engagement with the fund into our own supply chains, and then also value these benefits from this finance. And therefore, I think it's very, very important to understand where the journey goes in terms of what we value as a society. And we as Southwood just published a report called The Push and Pull of Net Zero, where we understood most net zero commitments actually come from customer demand. So large companies feeling the pressure and the desire of consumers to be more aligned with their brands, meaning that the brands do what the consumers consider important for a prosperous future. And in this survey, we also noticed that, wow, only about 6% had clearly increased their spending on adaptation and resilience. Now we understand, look, net zero seems to be a good word, a buzzword out there, which is very important and shows a strong ambition, and it seems to be fueled by customer demand. I wonder, what about resilience and adaptation? Wouldn't, if large companies stepped up to that and, for example, followed the example of Chanel, were also to invest more explicitly in resilience and adaptation, for example, in a joint partnership with the public sector, just like with the Jeff, to really make sure you have this integrated approach? Wouldn't then also this adaptation action become a very, very strong driver for customer loyalty and overall supporting this norm development and these values? And I think with this value change shift, we have the opportunity to really drive more catalytic capital and more corporate action and more philanthropic capital into adaptation, resilience, and overall, let's say, positive, sustainable solutions as they're all integrated.
Really interesting. Thank you very much. Now let me open up questions to colleagues here. Let's start with you. Have we got a roving...
Okay, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. So a question for South Pole and the Landscape Resilience Fund. So I completely see the value of having greater customer loyalty because you guys are really doing something amazing for the environment. But how are the returns? Just the pure financial returns. What are you promising to these investors? I understand that for the investors, you're actually trying to attract that is absolutely a secondary nature. But to really grow it much further for the finance people in these big firms that just do it because they have to, what sort of returns are you offering?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. And here I think it's very important to look at the world with a very sober mind, because I think there's various players, and some focus on larger companies or rising technologies that can already now promise solid returns. What we are doing with the Landscape Resilience Fund is really focusing on the most vulnerable landscapes that are working in agriculture and forestry, and that often we see are not ready yet to make clear promises about any returns. And if we were constrained by our financial returns expectations, we would risk missing our target group. So this is why we are a venture philanthropy organization. We're a Swiss foundation that is not ever going to actually distribute returns to the investors, but we are a revolving fund that will reinvest returns, if we make them, into new businesses to achieve more impact. So our investors, they notice that we are pretty much somebody that comes in, accelerates and scales climate resilient practices, then connects these businesses with return-seeking investors who have clear return expectations, but they vary. And Jay could say something to that, because he very successfully achieves this bridge between adaptation, finance, and financial returns for his investors. But we then connect these SMEs, once they're successful, with return-seeking investors, and we invest in new SMEs that are, again, smaller, more rural, more vulnerable.
We've got a question online here. Obviously, there's a long way to go before we have a well-functioning market for adaptation credits, similar to carbon mitigation credits. For example, quantifiable, verifiable values that provide measurable outcomes regarding, say, food security or nutritional diversity. Clearly, one thing we need to do is develop agreed-upon impact accounting systems. For example, Lightsmith Group suggests tying in with the ICMA harmonized framework for impact reporting for social bonds. That's a mouthful. What are the other steps? How do we actually pilot the use of these systems on the ground? And I will go to Jay, if I can, for that one.
Yeah, maybe to pick up just quickly on what Urs said and then talk about this question. You know, I think that we're at an experimental, all the above stage in terms of where the actual investment returns are going to turn out to be across different types of strategies. And the craft strategy itself calls for a blended finance approach. And as we mentioned, there's a technical assistance facility designed to accelerate the technology on a non-commercial basis or on a pilot basis to prove out that initial set of economics, just as was done in the early days of renewable energy. If you waited for solar panels to be manufactured in Kenya to deploy them in Kenya, we would still be waiting a long time, to the detriment of people's ability to have clean energy access in Kenya. So I think the flip side to that is, I think that what you're seeing at the COP is the recognition that the energy transition is absolutely going to be underway, and the low carbon transition is absolutely going to be underway, driven by both reality and the quote unquote inevitable policy response, but also customer demand, consumer demand for this kind of stuff. And the flip side to that, I think, is we see that investments in adaptation and climate resilience are absolutely going to be extremely attractive investments over the medium to long run. So let's put it this way. Over the next 10 years, so at COP36, if we're here, if such a thing exists, the question is, what do you think will have happened between now and then? And I can't really predict for you what the interest rate curve is going to look like or what the political landscape is going to look like. But I can probably tell you with a high degree of confidence, according to the IPCC and others, that the climate will have changed a lot. And my 5-year-old, who I'm shocked has not joined us for this virtual conversation so far, will be 15 years old. And the world that she's going to inhabit is going to look very different than the one we inhabit today. So do you think that there will be demand for technologies to understand how that's going to happen and for solutions to be embedded in that? Do you think that there will be demand for products and services to help us through that transition to a world which will increasingly be more complex going forward? Do you think that there will be successful investments in technology and entrepreneurship that can scale to meet that challenge? And do you think we can make choices now that can anticipate that and try to focus on that and shape it in a way that actually has more successful outcomes? I would argue that the answer to that is absolutely yes. And the faster we get to that answer, the better off we're going to be. There will be large-scale technologies and solutions that will absolutely need to be developed between now and then and in the future. And if we can shape those in a way that is equitable,
that incorporates a bunch of these different other sets of considerations, we'll have a much better future going forward. Now, as to the question about how to accelerate SMEs on the ground and other activities, I think there's a range of different instruments that are out there. The Jeff has many. WWF at the local level has a number of them as well. You've seen the range of perspectives from venture philanthropy to commercial investment to TA and so on. Then absolutely in the context of our colleague from Vietnam, the on-the-ground activity, which was really well, this will all happen in communities that incorporate these set of considerations. That's really what we're really aiming to do. To do that at scale is going to require, again, like I said, an all of the above effort and the integration of as many different tools as we possibly can to engage in this transition as we kind of go underway. And I think that's the challenge we have to face today.
Thank you. And Tran, actually, if you could tell us a little bit about, because I was thinking that we have to hope that we're not going to get to the worst of these impacts from climate change before people start to invest at this scale, which is why one of the reasons why this fund is so important. But Tran Trung Hien, could you tell us a little bit about what the main challenges are for rattan farmers that you can see? So what are the main issues that rattan farmers are facing on the ground, and how are you addressing those in your operations?
Yes, thank you so much for your question. So in my central landscape, animal landscape now, I see climate change has caused the droughts, typhoon, and massive floods. So it caused serious damage of long-term livelihood for poor people. It's serious damage for asset and the life of the farmer. For example, related to our rattan community who living in mountainous area. So due to extreme droughts in the summertime, the survival of rate of enrichment is low. Even we support them, but the survival rate is enrichment rattan is low. Or due to heavy rain and flood in the rainy season, it prevents farmers come to the forest for tending or harvesting rattan. So in my role, we had like a community relationship very long term, because from the first my father had very close relationship with them. So as my new generation, I had a new team. So in order to address the challenge, I and my staff and lab project has some solution like this. Our company work closely with the local farmer to survey and select suitable site and timing for enriching and planting rattan. For instance, planting rattan in the wet weather, so the suitable time for rattan growing well. Or tending or harvesting rattan in dry season is better than the rainy season. And we will buy all the rattan tree from them almost in the dry season. So we will stop for them. And we had to support very closely community. We give them rattan seedling, training to take care of the rattan. We also buy from them. We go to with them to tell them, okay, this is our contact with you, to make sure when you grow up your rattan, when you take care of the rattan forest, I will buy from you with fair market price. So the people say, okay, the company come here, so they feel believe. And then when they get the money, the cut every day, when they sell the rattan, they feel this is a good livelihood. So importantly, when community recognize rattan is a sustainable source for a livelihood, so they will enhance the awareness of importance of natural rattan. They will protect the natural rattan better than before. So I really see many farmers just 2 years in the lab project, but the people, they don't think the rattan tree like a normal tree. They see the rattan tree is a livelihood tree. So rich tree, not only normal tree, rich tree give them the food, give them the livelihood, and rich tree become the product is sold to international market. So they feel pride and they feel they should protect the Russian forest better. So this is my opinion.
Very inspiring, Tran, to hear the reality of what it's like running an SME in that context. And talking about the international supply chain, it makes me think about your comment, Cause, in terms of Chanel's supply chain and how important it's going to be to integrate this sort of private finance into companies' own supply chain so that those companies don't just abandon a community when it becomes difficult to supply the supply chain, but instead invest in it because these impacts are going to be felt everywhere. It's not going to be able to. You're not going to be able to move from one context to another if an impact is felt in one area rather than another. So, I think it's really interesting example of how to invest in your supply chain all the way up and down, because we know what it's like when supply chains are interrupted. I had one question for Avril. If you could take this one, Avril. What kind of financial facilities do you provide to SMEs? Is it equity-like instruments or debt? Is there a dimensional criteria you consider for a company to be investable?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. We at the GEF are, I would say, risk prone. So we like to take risks as long as we invest in projects that deliver systemic transformation that Jay mentioned. Like we are investing in solutions that have the potential to then be scaled up and have some type of broader effect at the project itself. In that regard, when we talk about investing in SMEs, we don't have a criteria, we don't have a maturity, and I think this is something we haven't really talked about much, but in the landscape financing and in resilience financing, we're talking about timeframes that are longer than what the commercial finance usually provides. So we're here to provide the softer side of the financing in blended finance structures. So as to, on the one hand, the SMEs can invest and do what the type of investment that would deliver these environmental benefits and at the same time create the livelihoods. And as we were just listening from Tran, that's what will make the difference at local level for one farmer to invest in a certain way or the other. So to secure that livelihood, and on the other hand, make sure that we're having the environmental benefits that the project is intending to do, that the resilience that is intending to create will be there by the end of our investment. I would say, though, in general, to guide that type of answer. So the GEF provides any type of financial instrument that would help de-risk in a blended finance structure a given investment. And if you talk to the broader investment community, and here Jay could talk way better than I do, since that's his job to then go and find other investors. But we see that on the one hand, if you're doing an equity investment in a fund, senior investors would not look at anything beyond, I would say, 10-12% IRR return. And we are willing to go as an equity investor to very low levels or no returns so that the blended finance structure can generate that type of return for the investor, the commercial finance investor, the broader financial institutions who need and have that type of requirement. As of today, unfortunately, we haven't yet arrived to a risk return profile that for adaptation would be swallowed, I would say, without sweeteners or softeners by the broader financial institution and other types of investors. We're not there yet. And we're not there yet because, and that's another type of discussion, because the risk assessment that we're doing does not take into consideration that these resilience measures, what they're doing is reducing the risk, is not increasing the risk. And to do that type of analysis, then we need to involve the insurance industry. We need to involve as well the rating agencies, not in the ESG format, but the actual credit risk and the investment risk that we're talking about when we invest in these SMEs. We at the Jeff, then, to very long way to respond to you, we use a multiple financial instruments as long as we can de-risk the investment of this private sector investment community that we're seeking to bring to invest in these developing countries and very risky communities and SMEs. And we're hoping that with measures, metrics, knowledge, we in COP36, Jay, will talk about a credit risk assessment that takes climate into consideration, and therefore investment in resilience as a way to improve that risk assessment, and that way, I would say, unleash private sector investment at a broader scale.
Very interesting, Avril, and you've brought up so much that I want to ask about, and I can see Jay nodding away, so I might bring you in a minute, Jay. But a stupid question, therefore, Jay. Is that just because is one of the reasons partly because we're just measuring the wrong stuff, as in we're measuring GDP rather than our stock of natural capital that would allow us to, if you like, adjust the returns that we might get from that. I'm not a finance person at all, as you can tell, I think, from this conversation, but it seems to me that would then unlock a different form of measurement that would allow the returns to be different returns, or to be shoring up future growth. I'm really not explaining myself very well, but I'm hoping that Jay might be able to help make sense to myself, and then I'll come back to this room to see if we've got any more before going back to the online questions. Jay, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, maybe I'll just say two things on measurement. And Avril touched on this before, that there's been this sort of artificial set of distinctions between mitigation or traditional global environmental benefit measurements and adaptation and resilience. Like adaptation is some kind of island that you visit every so often, but it's not connected to the mainland, which is either just broad environmental benefits or climate as mitigation. It's one country we're going to live in, which is the future, and it's going to change all the time. And how we measure that is really important. So I would advocate for the Jeff and all the UNFCCC institutions a much more flexible set of approaches and ability to actually look at adaptation, mitigation, biodiversity as an integrated approach, because we're going to live in an integrated future. So to the extent that there's siloing that has historically occurred, that needs to be broken down and moved forward. In terms of the measurement problem, there's one of the problems that's kind of a problem in the kind of traditional measurement approaches. We have a really bad approach to measuring adaptation right now. The current only agreed approach, and we have a separate impact measurement system in the craft strategy, attempts to calculate different quantitative measures, but not just in terms of finance. The current way the UNFCCC accounts for adaptation is by how much we spent, which is a terrible way to count things. So if you spent $100 million last year, the value you got for it was $100 million. Did you know how many people you touched? Not really. Did you know if you changed the landscapes in any particular way? Not really. Did you know whether you did a more efficacious or efficient intervention last year than the year before? Not really. In mitigation, we have a common currency, which is tons of carbon dioxide equivalent avoided. We don't have yet such a thing in the adaptation landscape. And we would advocate for either a mixed approach in water and agricultural stress. The race to resilience is trying to count beneficiaries, direct or indirect, and so on. But there needs to be some other approach to measuring not just the amount of money that we spent this year or last year. And I'll tell you why. There's an example of a retrofit of a port that was done. And to do that, they were building a breakwater to protect it against storm surges. And so the Multilateral Development Bank that did that project asked for new analysis to account for future climate scenarios. And the engineering company came back and said, we have great news. We've redesigned the breakwater. It's now going to protect the port against existing storm surges and the future storm surges from the following climate scenarios. And the MDB was like, that's great. And then the engineering company said, and even better news, by redesigning it, the breakwater is now 30% lower material cost. So we've actually saved 30%. And then there was a huge bureaucratic problem because now you've spent negative 30% on adaptation. So the idea that adaptation and resilience, just like mitigation, is a cost adder is a false premise.
You can save energy and reduce carbon footprint, energy efficiency. You can save water and increase resilience as well as energy efficiency, because water is incredibly intensive. And so if we only measure how much we spent on adaptation or resilience as a metric of a figure of merit, we're going to get exactly what you think we're going to get, which is more spending and not really clear what we got value for money. So let's fix that first, right? And protect more people and cheapen the cost and create an incentive to do that. And second, to your point about natural capital, and this is the kind of puzzle on biodiversity, and natural capital solutions is generating a measurable benefit to the private sector. And I completely agree with you. If you have mangroves, you can have lower insurance premiums. And if we can capture that and measure that, and things like the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, CCRI, are trying to do those kinds of things in a really formal financial sense, to translate that for the private sector, who measures everything effectively in risk in terms of credit risk, which is what Avril was saying as well. So if you can turn those inputs into something that the private sector currently digests, which is credit risk, then I think you can really move a lot of things, like premium price on carbon or other approaches, I think really moves that through the rest of the system in a way that the system actually really understands today. That being said, I take your challenge as one that we all need to be thoughtful about going forward. We don't live in a single future. We will live in a single future, and that future needs to account for nature and biodiversity. It needs to account for gender and equity. It needs to account for vulnerable populations in a way that I think up to this point, it simply has not done as well as it ought to have. And you've seen that, I think, laid out in stark contrast in this attempt to recover from COVID, right? On the one hand, I think if we took a UNFCCC approach to the COVID crisis, we might still be waiting for interventions to really address this. On the other hand, the approach that has been taken by some of the wealthier countries versus the poorer countries, I think leaves open to a lot of challenges and criticism about how equitable that solution set is going to be going forward. And that recovery that we have from this very, very challenging global situation is one that needs to take account of those factors. Vulnerable populations who are more vulnerable anyway, that are again to take it on the chin again from climate, that need to recover from COVID in a future that's going to be hopefully more inclusive from a gender perspective, and then more thoughtful from a biodiversity and nature perspective. So that's a complicated answer. If we fix the stuff with the system we currently have, that would be a big plus. But I think the challenge for all of us is to think about this in a more systemic and transformational way, and to integrate those assumptions into these decisions that we're making now. Trillions of dollars, which ordinarily get spent over a 10 to 20 year period, will now be accelerated in deployment over the next year to 2 years in decision making. So we're going to collapse like a 10-year period of decision making into the next 2 years. And what we decide to do now and what considerations we incorporate into that set of decisions will shape the future for the next 10 to 50 years. And that's a really, really important set of questions we need to ask. And I think it's important to have that discussion now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for making sense of my stupid question. Can I open the floor again here to see if there are any other questions here before I go back to one online? Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Sarah, and I wanted to ask a bit regarding, or you talked a bit before about the definition of adaptation, how it has developed, and also comparing to the definition of mitigation. And secondly, at this COP, we have heard many pledges for increased funding to adaptation, but only a tiny little bit of funding to loss and damage. I believe Scotland started a small fund. So one question I have to you, how you see the difference between adaptation and loss and damage, and because I think you can see some actions which are you can see as adaptation, but they are like reducing the risk for loss and damage. Like, would you say those things would be classified as loss and damage financing or be classified as adaptation financing? I don't know if you're the right people to speak to this, but I just wanted to raise it up if in case someone of you has an answer on this, because just an example like early warning systems. So it's a way of, I've heard it about as adaptation, but it can also be seen as a way to reduce loss and damage. So I wanted to ask you about this.
Very political question, but also very in the moment, if you like. I mean, I would say that our colleagues in negotiating rooms would not want to see any conflation of loss and damage and adaptation, but it's an interesting question to ask in terms of definitions. Koos, would you like to comment on that one?
I can take. Hello, I can take a stab at it, and granted, I'm not an expert in the different definitions as they're used in the political context of the negotiations, but the way that we look at adaptation is not only in a way of sudden extreme weather events that would, for example, include natural disasters and storms that would then directly cause immediately visible losses and damage, but we also include, let's say, more hidden and slowly developing and unfolding losses and damages that, however, at first sight may not be obvious. And one of these could be just the slow onset of longer periods of consecutive dry days over time, leading to droughts or water shortage, or overall higher temperatures, maybe particularly in different seasons where the temperatures used to be lower, and therefore, for example, impacting the overall ecosystems, or of course also the harvests. And to my understanding, when we talk about disaster risk reduction, for example, and there's also a thing called eco-DRR, ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, for example, where I would say that is mostly looking at particular clearly noticeable events based around which you develop a strategy to reduce the risk for that, and therefore the losses and damages that result from that, while we will also really include anything that helps include overall ecosystem stability, not just targeted at one particular event that may be coming, but also at any other type of slowly onsetting climatic change. But I'm happy to give it to other panelists as well.
I think if I can just add another question that came in online, which was, as we think about leveraging private and public financing together, to what degree should we think that adaptation is just like mitigation, but a little earlier on the experience curve? And then in brackets, they've said one key difference: adaptation outcomes are more diverse, making measurement harder. But to Jay's point, mitigation seemed hard to quantify 20 years ago too. Is there anyone that would like to answer that? But also, can I ask my esteemed panelists to sum up for me, thinking a little bit about the level of urgency that we have here, and what should be done in terms of adaptation financing to try and address this level of urgency and not wait for the worst impacts that are still to come. So if I can go to Avril next on the definitions and to start the sum up, and then I'll come to Tran, Jay, and then finally Koos.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. It's actually a blurred, again, frontier, but my understanding, and I'm not part of the negotiation, so that would be other part of my colleagues, and my understanding that I have from them is that loss and damage is about compensation. It's about whenever you incur in a disaster, how are you as developed countries going to compensate for the losses that a given climate change event has created. Investing in adaptation versus mitigation, though, goes more to increase the, I would say, adaptive capacity of the countries. So it's not a compensation aspect, but it's rather a preparation. And in that respect, you mentioned the early warning signs. I think that would be more on the preparation side than on the compensation. Compensation to me is more a concept, if you would like, that would relate in our world of civilians to insurance. Like, so you are hit by a typhoon, God forbid, and then you're compensated by the losses and the damages that typhoon that was caused by climate change, that has been mostly originated by, according to all the data, the developed countries already accumulated GHGs in the atmosphere, then you would need to compensate for that. I don't know if that is a good enough explanation. Yeah, good. As for the curve, are we earlier in the curve now in adaptation than in mitigation? I wanna say, you know, I really like the example that Jay gave earlier in the panel, that you say you don't wake up in the morning, or you didn't wake up 20 years ago thinking about, I want a low carbon transportation mode. This has come a long way up to now with an understanding and I would say a multi-stakeholder plethora of actors, including governments, but also consumers and companies. I believe that it will come to that point with adaptation too. But and I think that's a very important different point, is that the currency of impact, so the GHG or the carbon equivalent for climate change mitigation, does not exist in climate change adaptation. Adaptive capacity or increasing resilience takes many, many forms, and in each country, and it's highly heterogeneous. In any country that would differ, not only by country level, but by geographic area in that country, it would be different. So we would need that, I think, further complicates, but we should end up further complicates the standardization or understanding. However, there should be a broader understanding that whenever you pursue an infrastructure investment, it should be resilient by default. Like, you need to look at the climate change mitigation, the climate change scenarios for 1.5 degrees and even more, 2.5 degrees Celsius, and how will that affect your infrastructure in the next X years. The same goes for businesses. If there's a big agribusiness going to set up operations in Brazil, what does that look like in 15, 10, 20 years from now? And how can we do an agribusiness that is resilient and at the same time smart and capture carbon? So all of that needs to be integrated, and I think we will get there with the additional challenge of the lack of common currency, and that resilience is measured in many, many different ways, and it should, because the reality in countries and on the ground is different. So that's my 2 cents on that too.
Thank you, Avril. That phrase, the currency of impact, being harder to divide in adaptation, is going to be ringing with me long beyond this. Tran, if you could sum up for me before we close, what gives you hope in terms of rattan farmers that you're working with, and the amazing business that you have inherited and are taking forward into the next generation?
Yeah, thank you for your question. As you know, we are stay near the mountain with many local farmers. All of them is ethnic people. So I think we should invest for smallholder, for ethnic people in the mountain. So when they had a good livelihood, so they will when it protect the rattan, the natural rattan forest is better. So how to do that? How to help them? So I think, as you see in rattan value chain, the SME, the company, I think we can hold a key role. We link the farmer to the international market. So I think we should invest to SME, and from the SME, we will invest to the local farmer. So by this way, we do the win-win model, as I said before. So we had an example before when USAID grant for me 1%. So I had equity also. So we really get the finance, get the grant from the USAID, but we yield on for the farmer, and then we get the effect for them, and then they get the effect back for me. So I think the green business, it means the sustainable business and clear environmental and social benefit should receive more favorable conditions from the local bank, from the international financing. So it had good, it helped them, me and our SME company can have good asset concessional loan. or longer grace period for payment. So we have more, we think about business first, but we think about environmental and social also. So we need, I think so, need invest in the value chain by invest to the SME, then from the SME to the farmer. So it business growing good, so we can invest more. So that's in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Jay?
Well, let me say just two things. One is about the timing, and the other one is something what Tran spoke about too. On timing, I think the analogy to where we are in terms of conceptualization and measurement and kind of systematic approaches on the adaptation side and on the investment side for adaptation finance is absolutely 10 to 15 years behind where we should be, right? Like it's now 7% and change of total climate finance. The Secretary General's called it Code Red for the planet. And he wanted 50% to be adaptation, 50% to be mitigation, and we're still stuck in the single digits here and have been for a long time. There's movement, but literally, according to the Climate Policy Initiative and the Global Commission, the Global Center on Adaptation in January, less than $500 million can be attributed to private investment to adaptation, which is like, rounding error terms in terms of a multi-trillion-dollar economy that we live in. So in terms of where we are in terms of thinking about it and investing in it, we're very early. The flip side is the urgency is immediate and here and now, and will continue to change at an accelerating rate. So 5 years ago, people were saying, well, when do we really need adaptation? Maybe that's like a 2,100 polar bears and coral reefs problem. And the issue you're thinking about was like sea level rise, which feels to folks that don't live on small island developing states like some 2050, 2075, like gradual creeping problem that will maybe occur someday. The difference is today what you have is massive inundation events, and while childhood asthma wasn't on the screen of really problematic climate impacts, it turns out if you light everything on fire all the time, respiratory ailment accelerates dramatically, and the healthcare impacts of climate change I think are going to unfold and be another vector of impact on humanitarian aspects of this disaster that we're going to be facing going forward. So we have no time on dealing with adaptation and investing in adaptation and climate resilience. And we need to kind of catch up on how we're thinking about it and investing in it to where the reality and the need is going to be. And that I think is the really critical challenge, and do that at the same time as mitigation. We are out of time on climate change on both sides. The second point is to what Tran was saying a bit.
Thank you, Jay. Terrifying and so important. Cause, can I ask you to sum up for me, and then we'll close?
Sure. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for these great closing words by my co-panelists. And it's true, right? We're out of time, and you can always also continue developing methodologies to get the right metrics and to better analyze the impacts of what you're doing. But then sometimes it's also important to work with what you have right now, and also trust your intuition to some extent. And the good thing about nature-based solutions is we know that by mimicking nature and by building solutions that are diverse and build on the stability of nature around communities and within where communities live, we have a very good chance at addressing all of these issues, right? Including adaptation, resilience, mitigation, biodiversity conservation. And at the same time, also, we have to recognize there are many things that we can do to invest in small businesses. And in fact, there's a $5.2 trillion financing gaps for MSMEs around the world. And we need to finance them in any way we can, pretty much. At the same time, we need to continue to work with government, given that there's about $500 billion in harmful subsidies, mostly in the agricultural sector, but also in forestry and fisheries, that we need to somehow get rid of and find smarter ways to deal with. So we need to work with the public sector, with the private sector in partnerships, and we need to get going and definitely inspire entrepreneurs, such as here in Vietnam, such as in many other countries, entrepreneurs that are locally based, that understand their problems, help them make sure they can make long-term plans, that they know there will be a market for their products, that there will be investors that have patience and that are flexible, and that will provide that financing that scale for international value chains that are based on nature and serve humans and nature alike.
Yeah, in the end, best is the enemy of the good, isn't it? We've got to start with what we've got now. And huge thanks to all my panelists, but particularly Tran Trung Hien, who I imagine has joined us quite late. But Avril also from the Jeff for your investment at a with a ability to invest in things and take high risks, because this is exactly what we need at the moment. Jay, for all your inputs, and Cause for your leadership of the Landscape Resilience Fund. Thank you all so much. Thanks for coming here and online, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye. See you.
Thanks very much. Bye now.
Bye.